Okay. Hey, everybody. Good morning. Okay, good morning, everybody. Now we're running a little late. We want to get started. Well, we're running a lot late. Ooh. Okay, we're going to figure this out. So, hey, y'all, if you can hear me once, that's clap. You hear me twice? Clap. Clap twice. Sorry. If you hear me, y'all know what I'm saying. Clap 3 times. I'm still discombobulated. Okay, my name is Dr. Wilson. Excited to have y'all here at the for the CEEJH Symposium, our 10th anniversary symposium. This is the 3rd day of the symposium. As I said earlier, we're running a little bit behind, so I'm gonna try to catch us up. We had a really exciting day yesterday where we had Reverend Yearwood, who gave a rousing keynote speech. He talked about, storytelling, the importance of culture and art, and the importance of young people. And he also said, make sure you have something outside of yourself, because this work is hard to do, right? So have faith, something outside of yourself. And then also, we want to be able to, this is a relay race, we have to be prepared to pass the baton. Of course, we also then had multiple sessions, first block. We had a really great lunchtime plenary session. There was a fellow who talked about, stuff at that time with some great panelists, Dr. Michelle Martinez and also Harold Mitchell, who coined the term pimping people's pain at a Crackle Barrel in 2009 in Columbia, South Carolina. So, and then we closed out with a session on legislative issues in Maryland. And so today we want to start out talking about, more of these issues and really get into environmental justice and have another one of the leaders in the movement, Mustafa Ali, speak. So let me just hurry up. We're going to skip some of the things. I've already done some of these items before. Thank the sponsors again. Sorry, sponsors. Y'all got some love on the first 2 days. We got to hurry up. Tic Tac Hub Partners, we're going to give y'all more love later. Yeah. Y'all know that all stuff is in your conference guide. So here's our setup for the day. Mustafa is going to speak. Then we're going to have a morning plenary afterwards. Then we have a lunchtime plenary and a closing plenary. And then, of course, tomorrow we're going to close out the keynote from Bernice Miller Travis and have a full day of activities and a closing celebration. So our keynote speaker today is Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. Mustafa is Executive Vice President of Conservation and Justice for the National Wildlife Federation, former interim chair of programs at the Union Concerned Scientists, instructor at American University, and is the founder and chief executive officer of Revitalization Strategies. He also serves as a commissioner for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before joining the Federation, Mustafa was the senior vice president for the Hip Hop Caucus, a national nonprofit and nonpartisan organization that connects the hip hop community to the civic process. He began working on social justice issues at the age of 16 and joined the EPA as a student, becoming a founding member of the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. So a couple more connections about Mustafa. Mustafa was also an ECO associate, right? So remember we had our closing session about the ECO program on the first day. And also Mustafa is a member of esteemed Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity incorporated. We're both brothers in that fraternity. So y'all see my black, I got my gold in my pocket. Gold right here. Yeah, gold right here. Let me just pull it out. It's a little bit gold for y'all. And just let's welcome, I'm being silly. Let's welcome Mustafa to the stage, everybody. Mustafa Santiago Ali.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, let's try it again. The sugar didn't kick in yet, did it? Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Oh, let's try it one more time because I believe in the power of the Trinity. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, that's better. I never stand up on these stages very much. I want to apologize to you. I have given thousands and thousands and thousands of presentations. I have never, ever been late for one. And today is the first time. I also want to thank Dr. Jacoby Wilson, and everyone here at the University of Maryland for this conference, but also for their dedication to environmental justice and climate and public health. Could you give CEEJH a round of applause, please? So this campus is a little different than when I was here. I'm driving around, looking around, seeing all the construction, and it makes me think about our communities and how important infrastructure is, how important building is when it is done in an equitable fashion. I also want to give honor to my mother and my grandmother, who are the rocks that I stand on. I've given all these speeches, and I always make sure that I bring their names forward by a show of hands, your right hand. How many folks love your mother or your grandmother? Raise your right hand. Everybody look around, find the angry people. We're going to get it popping. I think it's important that we make sure that we honor where we come from and the roads that we had to travel to be here in this moment. And a part of that is also, and CEEJH's looking at me because CEEJH told me that I had 25 minutes to talk about 37 things. So we're going to do the best that we can. That quote that was up there from Mahatma Gandhi is an important one because it talks about how the earth provides enough for every man and woman and family's needs, but not enough for their greeds. Does that make sense to everyone? And that's how we find ourselves in this moment. And we also understand that when we're talking about these incredibly important issues that you have been working on, not only over the last couple of days, that it is an intersectional set of opportunities and impacts that are happening. And I always bring forward Audre Lorde, who is an amazing writer, amazing activist. How many folks in the room know who Audre Lorde was? Raise your hand. All right, so we got about 12 folks who are in here. I would encourage you to check out her work because not only on LGBTQIA issues and civil rights issues, and women's issues, she talked about all the ways that these types of things can come together, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today as we move forward. I also have to bring forward all these amazing leaders who are in the environmental justice movement, and you will notice that there are no men that are in those pictures, and that is intentional. It is intentional because the environmental justice movement has been a matriarchal movement. There have been a few brothers, men who have played a significant role, but I like to make sure that we are putting the proper foundation in place. And as you can see, they represent many, many groups. Now, in all these thousands of speeches I have given, I never talk about myself because our issues, our work is about the community, but Dr. Wilson encouraged me to actually talk about my journey. And I would be remiss if I did not bring out, I grew up in two places. I grew up in Appalachia, and I grew up in Detroit. So I have to give a shout out to the area that I grew up in and the way that I got involved in these issues. My grandfather and my father were both working on workers' rights and civil rights issues. And we grew up in a community that was very Norman Rockwell-y, if I could say it that way, in the sense that growing up, you know, you're outside playing basketball, football, you were making cabins, you were fishing, you were hunting, you were doing all these different types of things that everyone should have the ability to do. But then we also found out that we had almost a 50%, it was really about 47% cancer rate in our community. And this is one of the reasons why. This is the Reedsville power plant. It was there for almost 100 years. In my community, if you look at that bottom picture, right across the river where you see that hillside, that was my community. And when we were outside playing, the emissions from the plant would blow across. It was a very, very old plant. And we were also built on an old coal mine. So we got our water from a spring that had heavy metals in it. So I've never really talked too much about that before, but I thought it was important when we talk about the history, each and every one of us brings our own history to the movement. Each and every one of us brings our own set of skills and tools and blessings to be able to make change happen. And sometimes we don't see the impacts that are happening because people make the assumption that there's nothing dangerous that's going on there. Now, in thinking about the history of environmental justice, we often start at some really important things. I'll talk about Warren County, North Carolina. I'll talk about a number of other things, but when Dr. Wilson asked me to talk about the history, I had to go back to 1619 because when we first brought enslaved peoples to this country and we began an extractive process of both our indigenous brothers and sisters and African peoples, that began the paradigm for the way folks would operate for the next sets of hundreds of years in relationship to the environment, in relationship to resources, in relationship to power. And sometimes we like to forget a part of our history, but it's important to remember it, of course, so we don't repeat it. Does that make sense to everyone? I see some people nodding their head. Another part of the movement, of course, is 1968 with Dr. King and with the sanitation workers. And it's important that we have this conversation because we're talking about worker justice, we're also talking about environmental justice, and we're talking about power dynamics. And Dr. King being a part of the work that needed to happen in that moment was incredibly important. It's a benchmark, if you will, that we often don't talk enough about. The next slide you see there is for those of us who are raised in this movement incredibly important, and that's Warren County, North Carolina. Now, there were things that happened, of course, between 1619 all the way up to 1968, but it is in the 80s when we begin to start to pull some things together as a movement. And in Warren County, North Carolina, how many folks in the room know about Warren County, North Carolina? I'm assuming almost, well, only about half the folks. So once again, why this is so important for me is that, as Reverend Yearwood had shared with you yesterday, young people played a critical role in trying to stop those PCBs from coming into their community. Now, for those of you who are students of history and relationship to what happened there, then you know that there were a number of other locations that were better suited for those PCBs, but they made a choice to put it in the African American community instead of some of the others that were better suited. And then you also have Reverend Benjamin Chavis, who's down there in that bottom right-hand corner, who coined the phrase in the 80s also, environmental racism. So we have a number of terms that you all are very familiar with: environmental equity, environmental justice, environmental racism. And it's important for us to continue to place a spotlight on the disproportionality that happens to people of color, but also to make sure that we keep our arms open and wide for our white brothers and sisters who are in lower wealth communities who are also dealing with these impacts. And that's why we have the three different terms. But I want to make sure that people understand the significance, because there in Warren County, North Carolina, you had folks like Delegate Walter Fauntleroy from DC who went down, you had Dr. Chavis who was there, you had a number of people who were willing to lay down to stop those trucks from being able to come forward. And these are important moments. Those are also moments that help frame out for me the significance of my why. How many folks in the room, by a show of hands, know your why? Let's see. Hold your hands up high so those who don't know their why yet. Your why is going to be important. By a show of hands, how many folks ever had a tough day? Hold on, keep them up high. We got 2 people, 3. I know someone who didn't raise their hand. I worked with them before. I know they had a tough day. They had a tough day just listening to my craziness. It's important to understand that when we do this work, we're going to have some tough days. My mother used to talk about that all the time. She said, son, you're going to have some tough days. She said, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to deal with those. Now, every day since I've been 16 years old, I found some words of empowerment that I use to help center me whenever I'm having a tough day. And I say, when I get up, I say, I'm blessed and highly favored. Been doing that for a number of years. And I see some folks who understand the power of you choosing what those words are that represent where you're trying to be and how you're trying to be centered. Dr. Wilson may have already helped you to tap into that necessary energy. And if I'd have been on time, I would know, and he's going to make sure that I never forget about being late again. Well, I want y'all to try something with me. I want y'all to say, I'm blessed and highly favored. I understand that I am in a room full of heathens, so we're going to try it again. I'm blessed and highly favored. Now, the words may change based upon who you are, where you come from, but it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important also because there's a quote by James Baldwin who once said that if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. Think about how many times inside of our communities people don't see the impacts that are going on. People don't see the treasures and blessings that exist inside of our communities that we bring forward. People don't see our vision for the change that we're trying to make. And that is a part of our journey, is being able to make sure that we are not only seen and heard and valued, but that also our vision is a driver in the change that we so desperately want to make sure happens. Does that make sense to everyone? And that's why the quote by James Baldwin is so important. A part of the history also that sometimes we don't talk enough about is that as I was coming up, people used to say, well, the science isn't there. So the things that people are talking about can't possibly be true. Let me share a quick story with you. When I was a student, I looked like I was about 15 years old when I first went to the EPA. And I remember going to the first meeting on environmental equity. And I was walking down the hallway. There were two older gentlemen who were in front of me. They were managers, had been at the agency for a while. So they weren't paying much attention to me. We get on the elevator, and I remember them saying, I have no idea why we're going to this environmental equity, now we would say environmental justice meeting, because the things that people are sharing can't possibly be true. They must be lying. These are folks who had a responsibility for protecting public health and the environment. So imagine what folks had to deal with when they sat down with business and industry, or they sat down with academic institutions, or they sat down with a number of other sets of stakeholders. If the people who have responsibility for making sure that you are protected don't believe what's going on, then we've got work to do. And that's why these early reports that many of you may know about or not are so incredibly important, because they put a spotlight and they also put science around it to make sure that what needed to change had the data that was necessary. And that's everything from the work that the United Church of Christ and Commission for Racial Justice with Dr. Benjamin Chavis and Charles Lee and Bernice Miller Travis, who will be here with you tomorrow, when they in 1987 did that hard work of pulling that information together. And then, of course, you had at the EPA, which some folks don't know about, our report in 1992, which was incredibly important as well. Now, all of this came together not out of the goodness of people's hearts, but because stakeholders were pushing folks. They were pushing folks. And sometimes, even today, people get uncomfortable when communities push, because they're living with what's happening day in and day out, 365 days a year, so you have to understand the dynamics that are playing out. And that's why the Michigan Working Group, which is so incredibly important, because at the EPA there would have never been an Office of Environmental Equity, there would have never been a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, there would have never been an Environmental Justice Small Grants Program if communities had not played that critical role in pushing. And a part of that also came out of the first People of Color Leadership Summit. And you see the pictures there of individuals. Hundreds of people came from across the country to talk about types of things that were happening inside of their communities. And people began to have a better understanding of the similarities and commonalities that were going on. You often hear people say we have more in common than we have different. In this moment, people began to better have an understanding of that. And I was blessed to be there in the early days. But we still have a number of challenges that are taking place. And I'm pretty sure that you all understand many of these dynamics that are going on. Let me ask you, by a show of hands, in the last 60 seconds, how many people have taken a breath of air? Raise your hand if you've taken a breath of air. Let's see, find a non-air breather. We got one non-air breather over here. I'm gonna move to this side of the room. Keep your hands up. I need to know what's going on. I'm just looking over my shoulder at the non-air breather. I'm a little nervous. Well, let me ask this other question then. Since we have one non-air breather, hopefully they can answer this question. In the last 24 hours, how many folks in the room have been able to have a beverage? I say a beverage because if I say water, and some of y'all were out last night at the Marriott bar, it could be a little different. Bernice said she had water and a beverage. Why is that important? It's important because we work on trying to make sure that we have clean air and clean water and clean land and access to be able to frame out policy. For most folks, if you're not looking at it through a political lens, that would just make sense. It's human rights. It is the ability to be able to not just survive, but to be able to thrive. But we've seen over the years that even with the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and RCRA and a number of other acts that we have in place to help us to be more protected, that we still continue to have communities that fall through the cracks. Or some would say that there's intentionality in making sure that they are not protected because we make a choice between profit and people. Does that make sense to everyone? Everyone say profit over people. And that's the dynamic that we're trying to change. So when we see these major things that play out, they are just a snapshot in a greater set of challenges that folks have. And Dr. Wilson had asked me, what are some of the major things that you've worked on and items that you think have played a critical role in helping to make change or helping to highlight why we need to continue to make change? So one of them is Flint, Michigan. How many folks remember Flint, Michigan? Because we may have some younger people who at that time were not as aware. You know, when Flint happened, and many of us who were on the ground there, the dynamics was about politics. It is about lack of access to infrastructure that is healthy. It is about lack of caring about our most vulnerable communities. We've had, I believe the last number I saw was about 1.1 million who have been lead poisoned in our country, and we know that disproportionately it is black and brown folks and lower wealth white communities who continue to be the ones that are carrying that burden. And I remember when I was on this campus, and I remember thinking that if I had been lead poisoned, what were the odds of me actually being on the University of Maryland's campus or any of those other schools? And how different would life have been if I had to deal with that type of a situation, both mentally, physically, and spiritually? We often don't talk about the spiritual aspect of this work. We know that when you're exposed to lead, the neurological damages that can happen. We know that it can make it more difficult to learn. We know that when you have difficulty in learning, but you still have a family that you're trying to take care of, you're going to find some way of being able to garner money, because we live in a society where that's, a driver. So we have to think about the fullness of what's going on there. And we thought that, well, once we deal with what happened in Flint, many people thought, well, we'd never have to deal with these types of issues. Of course, the folks in this room understand the totality. When we were dealing with Flint, Michigan, there were over 3,000 other locations that were also having significant impacts from lead. And Jackson is just one of those that shows when climate and environmental injustice come together, the change that has to happen. Now, I want to share with you also, one of those other flashpoints for me was what happened in the Keystone XL, DAPL pipelines. And you know, we have 2.6 million miles of fossil fuel pipeline. Let me ask, by a show of hands, how many times can you go to the moon and back with 2.6 million miles? Anybody want to guess? Yes. Oh. He flinched and didn't know that that meant that he wanted to say something. How many times can you go to the moon and back? 2.6 million miles.
10.
10 times. Hang on. We have a counterpoint over here. 12 times. Anybody else want to guess? Anybody scared? She said one time. I guess you could. You could just stay there on the moon, right? You wouldn't have to worry about the pipelines then. It's important to bring the pipeline conversation in because it was a flashpoint where we saw many, many people coming together to stand in solidarity with each other because we understood the impacts that could happen to our water quality. We are depending on where the Earth is in its rotation and where the moon is. We're about 240,000 miles from the moon. That varies a little bit. So it gives you an opportunity. So some people were trying to take us to Mars. some folks to Venus. But it's important that we understand the totality of what's happening. So when Dr. Wilson had asked me about what do I think was one of the most important sets of work that was going on, it has to be what was happening around Keystone. I'm going to speed up a little bit because here are some of the other ones. I worked the BP oil spill. And when you saw the amount of oil that was rushing up onto the shores, it was kind of mind-boggling because you understood that there were people who were making their livelihood there. You had wildlife that was being impacted, and you had tough choices that people had to make about how to deal with the oil that had been released. And out of that, decades later, you still have individuals who have had impacts, and you also have stuff that continues to roll up. The other part that I wanted to raise of one of the significant events was Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was important because it placed a spotlight for the country on how significant the climate crisis was becoming and how ill-prepared we were. And we saw all kinds of folks who were on their roofs asking for help. We saw something folks don't talk about enough, brothers and sisters trying to go across the bridge to get to safety, and people on the other side of that bridge with guns saying, you can't come into my community. Now that's a little different, right? Because usually, and sometimes folks will ask, well, where do you see your humanity at in relationship to the world? Usually when we have a natural disaster, people come together. Even if that's not the way we live our lives in totality, but Hurricane Katrina put a spotlight on that. And I'm going to go a little bit faster because I know we're short on time. And then, of course, the other thing is the climate crisis, and we see right now all of the heat that is everywhere. We see the floods and the wildfires and a number of other things that are going on. And I thought that since Rev was here yesterday, that we also talk about one of the big changes that's happening is that we have artivists who are now stepping up and who are becoming a part of the fight, who are becoming a part of helping us to frame out directions. And then now, for the first time ever, so when I first started doing this work and we founded the Office of Environmental Equity, we had about $4 million for the entire country to do the work. And now we got billions of dollars. The question becomes, can we make sure that those dollars make it into the hands of the folks who need it the most, the folks who know how to get things done? Can we build the right partnerships and the right criteria to make sure that no one is forgotten? And that's why the new executive orders are important. That's why Justice 40 is important. That's why the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council is important, because we have a voice now. It's not just about having a seat at the table. People often talk about a seat at the table. If you don't have power while you're at that table, then you're just taking up space. And Justice 40 makes sure that, 40% of those benefits, but we've got to make sure that we frame out what that looks like. And then, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act allows us to rebuild our communities, and I was blessed to be able to play a role in the design of some of those. Now, challenges that we have in front of us. The Supreme Court is one. We've got Sackett. We know how Sackett turned out, the water case. We've got Chevron most recently, and then we have West Virginia versus EPA, which really hits home for me because I know what it's like to live in the footprint of a fossil fuel polluting facility. And to weaken protections makes it that we have to do that much more work, that we have to do it in a number of ways. And I want to make sure I don't mess up anybody's C3 status. So I will say that it is important to register to vote, and it's important to engage in the process. And I will not tell you who you should vote for, but I will say you should vote for somebody who cares about your communities. How's that sound? We're not going to get in trouble with that, are we? I got the thumbs up. So the Supreme Court is a big one. We've also got to make sure that now that we have a number of different folks in the philanthropic space who are giving, that it's focused in a way that benefits our communities. And not that just that the resources go to our communities, but that you are hiring individuals with experience in community is incredibly important, and I think it helps you to get further and further down the road. You also have to have organizations like the Union of Concerned Scientists and a number of other science organizations that have environmental justice and climate justice principles built into them, and that they are honoring them and that they are measuring them, just like we need all of the federal agencies to continue to build their capacity. Why do I bring this into our conversation? Because we have things like Project 2025. We have others who are trying to strip away the words environmental justice, the words climate change, and the work that's associated with that. That's not a political conversation. That is a reality, and we just have to figure out how we best address that. And I think we do it through making sure that we have the right partnerships in place and that we have individuals who understand how the levers of power work. What happens when we have all of this come together? Well, you had Harold here yesterday, is that correct? So you heard about the amazing work that the Regenesis Project has been able to do. And that's through the leadership from both Harold Mitchell and from community members of what our communities can look like when resources come together and we give communities the space to be able to make change happen. But there are lots of other folks. There are individuals in the room like Jerome Sabaz and others who have been able to transform community through the lens that communities find value in. And there's no need for me to talk about all the amazing things that Harold's been able to do. And you have folks like Reverend Buster Soares, who's also been able to make sure that we got new types of housing into the community, addressing some of the environmental concerns and creating job opportunities. Because we're not just talking about the environment, we're also talking about economic justice. You have the work we're doing over at NWF around the Clean Economy Coalition of Color, of making sure that folks have an understanding of where resources are and how to get to them. You have the TIC-TACs, which are incredibly important in helping people to navigate and helping people to be able to get to the resources that are so incredibly needed. But we got to make sure that we're also listening to the voices of communities if there are gaps in the process, and making sure as we move forward that we make that change happen. Let me back up, because I want to reinforce that point. When we created the Office of Environmental Justice and we started having grant programs and a number of other initiatives, they came from community. Community said these are the things that we need, and we worked hand in hand with them to create them. And as we would cycle through, we would go back and say, well, here were gaps. And we made the changes that are necessary. We can't forget the lessons of the past that have helped us to be in a better place. And then you have folks like the Green Door Initiative in Detroit and a number of others who are embracing the climate sets of opportunities in the economy and the traditional environmental justice ones, and are making change happen. And I'm going to close out here in a second, because real power, real change can only happen when people come together. And that's why the Women's March, which people often don't talk enough about in an environmental or a climate context, is so incredibly important. Because before the Women's March happened, I remember conversations from men who said that 1 million women would never come together. And sisters said, oh yeah? We got something for you. And not only did 1 million women come together, and by no means do any of the times we have large initiatives are they perfect, but it does set a precedent of what can happen, because women went back home, and girls, and said, if I can't find somebody who will run for office and who will represent my community in a form and fashion that is helpful, I'll do it myself. And that's why you began to see all these changes happening in state houses and on Capitol Hill and in local governments, because folks were getting empowered. And then, of course, the Science March. If I didn't talk about science, I would be short. The Science March was so incredibly important in that moment, because for a long time, and I know some of the scientists who are here in the room, who I love and adore and respect, but they will tell you also that traditionally, scientists usually don't like coming out their labs, right? And it was wild to see scientists try and learn how to march. So some of us who were there, we said, left, right, left, right, just forget it, just march. but it also began to change some dynamics because it also put a spotlight on the fact that we need scientists, and scientists have to be connected to community. And by doing that, we build these bridges. And that doesn't mean that we impact the validity of science, but it does say that we want to make sure that you have the fullness of the perspective that's necessary when we're bringing forward the results and the analysis that come out of science and the design of what it's going to look like. And as I close, I would be remiss if I did not talk about the amazing young people who have driven both what has happened in environmental justice and definitely now in the climate movement. And when we look at many of the resources that are now out there, you have to give credit to many of the younger people who are a part of that process of bringing forward how they want to change to look like, and the traditional environmental justice groups who had also for decades said, we need this, that, and this in this fashion, and let's get it done. So now we have a convergence of young people. We have a convergence of the experiences of frontline communities that are helping to frame that out. And that's what environmental justice is about. It's an interagency movement. So I was going to be short with you all today. And people will often ask me, how do we make real change happen? And I often tell folks to look to the person to your left. Everybody, just look to that person to your left. If your neighbor doesn't know their left, help them out. I saw someone who was lost. I wanted to help them be found. Now look to the person to your right. If you by now haven't seen the person who's next to you, well, just march. Reach out to the person on your left-hand side. It's okay. It's all right. I promise you, no one is going to jump you. No one is going to bite you. And Dr. Wilson has insurance in the University of Maryland. And now look out, reach your hand out to the person on your other side. I figure if I say other side instead of the right side, we'd probably be all right. Does that make sense? Everybody got him? It's okay. Grab that hand. Don't make me have to walk on this side of the room. You should have washed your hands before you left the house. Just like you're supposed to put on deodorant. All right. Now do me a favor, because I know I'm in a room full of talented people. Everybody stand up if you can. Yes, yes. That daggone Mustafa. We live in a world, in a country, where we unfortunately have people who are still trying to build walls between folks, who are trying to keep people separated. There's some reasons for that, and we can do that at another time. How many of you have ever been on an elevator, and as soon as you get on, you look at the numbers, and you're thinking to myself, Lord, please don't let anybody ask me anything. Right? Or we walk down streets, and we see people in need, and we often, not everyone, walks by. We lack to see their humanity. We're taught to keep moving. But when we change that dynamic, when we actually touch each other in an appropriate way, let me say that, there's something that is different in that moment, because it is no longer just about the individual. It is about us as a community. Dr. King said that we come to these shores in different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. I want you to think about that in relationship to climate change, in relationship to racial justice, in relationship to a number of issues that we continue to focus on. When we come together, we make real change happen. My grandmother says that you have power unless you give it away. I've seen this conference over the last decade help people to realize their power, helping them to understand that they're not in it by themselves, and that when we come together, there's absolutely nothing that we cannot do. Now, I also know that power can be a foreign concept to many people, because you are not supposed to be taught or believe that you actually have it. So I'm just going to ask the question, and you can shout out if you've been able to do this. In this room, how many folks in elementary school were taught about power? Okay. In middle school, how many folks took a class on power? So we have one person, two people in the back. At three people in the back. In high school, how many people were taught about power? All right, so we got about 4, 5, 6 more. And then you usually have to come to college before you're taught about power. And most people are nodding their head. So my grandmother says that you have that power, and she always asks me, if you're standing in front of folks, then ask them to acknowledge that. So on 3, I'm going to ask everybody to say power. 1, 2, 3. Power. That was anemic. Maybe we should change the dynamics. On 3, we're going to say power to the people. 1, 2, 3. Power to the people. Say it again, one last time. Power to the people. And since I do believe in the power of the Trinity, one last time, power to the people. Power to the people. Now take your power and build out that power with your brothers and sisters and family and with those who have the understanding that we can make real change happen. I'm Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali. Thank you all for a couple minutes of your time.
Power. I'm going to say on the mic, power to the people. Power to the people. Let's get it now. Come on. Okay, come on next session, actually. Come on, y'all. We're a little bit behind. We're going to have our next panel. We're talking about a little bit more about power. We had to probably cut it down to like 45, actually. Yes, 11. Yeah, we had to cut it down.
Do I do anything up here? Do I do anything up here? I'm good. I don't have to turn anything up here. Okay. I'm hoping that we can see 5 to 10 minutes. If possible, if not, at least 5. Okay. Okay, cool. All right, good morning, everyone. Do I sound okay? Perfect. All right, well, thank you all for being here this morning. I know this is a really energizing day. Oh, gosh. All right. Clap once if you can hear me. Clap twice if you can hear me. Clap 3 times if you can hear me. Clap 4 times if you can hear me. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you all. I really appreciate your patience with us this morning. I have the pleasure of introducing our plenary and moderating this session. My name's Megan. I'm with the Chesapeake Bay Funders Network. And in September of 2023, the Chesapeake Bay Trust, in partnership with CEEJH, led by Dr. Wilson, and 7 other partners were selected to receive and administer a $17 million grant with the USDA's Forest Service, which established what is now known as the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Fund. And I'm so excited to be able to introduce 5 partners and funders who will be working together over the next several years to implement this fund. We're joined by Dr. Wilson, Director of CEEJH and Professor with the Department of Global, Environmental, and Occupational Health at the University of Maryland. Jerome Shabazz, Executive Director with the Overbrook Environmental Education Center. Casey Wetzel, Vice President for Outreach and Education at the Chesapeake Bay Trust. Mo Pasternak, Program Assistant with the Agua Fund. And Carolyn Brunette, Co-Executive Director with Prince Charitable Trust. We are condensing things as much as possible, so more information on their bios and backgrounds can be found in the conference app. I'm hoping that we'll have 5 minutes for questions. If we don't, also look to your conference app to be able to get in touch with us for any follow-up questions or next steps. But I'm just going to go ahead and dive in now. So my first question is for Dr. Wilson, Jerome, and Casey. The Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Fund is the first large-scale EJ participatory fund in the region, and it stands to correct long-standing injustices for communities most affected by pollution. Can you share more about this fund? What is it? Why does it matter? Why is this model the right one? How did it come to be, and how will it be structured? So not a short question.
Can folks hear me? Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. So the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Fund is a participatory fund. For those that don't know that sort of jargony term in philanthropy, it means a succession of power to those that have been most impacted on the ground in frontline and fence line communities in the decision-making process. And that is different than how most philanthropic organizations have traditionally functioned. While my organization has always had external review processes, we've selected the reviewers in the past. We've designed the application package. That's going to be different here. The Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Fund is a partnership first, and the partners will decide how the application package looks. The partners will decide the evaluation criteria. The partners will decide who sits on the review committee. It's like I said, it's a giving over of power to those that should have been deciding all along how the funds should be flowing to the folks on the ground. And the partners that are involved in this will also be engaging folks on the ground on who will even apply and help them in that process. And so I don't want to hog the mic too much, so I'll pass that to Shakobi next.
Yeah, just to add to that, thank you, Casey. I did my, of course, little slides yesterday at lunch. Some of y'all may have been there to see that. And, part of what we talked about in one of the last slides, we think about environmental justice, the principles of environmental justice. I always talk about principle number 5, and it really talks about self-determination, communities speaking their own voice. And so having communities speak their own voice as it relates to grant making, and you heard from the keynote yesterday again from Reverend Yearwood, 12 of the largest environmental funders, right? He said 1.3 billion, and only 1 billion was going to CEEJH groups. This fund tries to rectify that, right? But also, if you think about the principles of environmental justice, when we think about representative justice, communities, drive the process. When we think about distributional justice, make sure those are most impacted get access to resources. So the fund seeks to actualize those principles, right? The fund wants to make sure that the folks who, again, you heard us say, who are at the front line should be at the front of the line when it comes to funding, but they also should be they should be in the front office in the implementation, right? I just modified that. Front of the line, in the front office. Okay, I'm gonna pass the mic.
Literally pass. So, as a hub partner in this process, what's appealing to me is the nature of co-production, knowledge co-production around our process, making certain that the community-based organizations are not sought at the back end of the process, but are included in the front end around how we're going to engage, what our outcomes look like, what our deliverables are, and most importantly, helping to set priority. The reality is that where we find the inequities, those inequities are usually procedural and is based in the process. We talk about the superficial inequities a lot, but we don't talk about the procedural inequities. And I think this structure is a great step towards mitigating some of those procedural inequities that enables the community organizations who need resource, who are administering resource, and actually giving credibility so that their colleagues can have trust in the resource, that it's authentic, it has the ability to deliver the services that we promise, and that we have community engagement from the start.
I reserved 15 minutes for this question, so we are ahead of schedule now. As a follow-up, one component of the of the EJ fund is having a foundation advisory council be a part of it, but not making the decisions of grant making. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. For Mo, Carolyn, and Casey that are on the panel, can you share a little bit more about how the Foundation Advisory Council will be involved? And specifically, what are the ways that you as funders will be supporting this effort while not making the decisions for where the funds are going?
So I'll just say just very briefly, and then I'll pass the mic to y'all. So the Foundation Advisory Council is an opportunity for funders regionally and nationally to either support directly financially the fund, and to also try to, frankly, bring in other resources to the fund, whether it's monetary or non-monetary in nature. But again, not part of the decision-making process, but there to support, as requested, the partnership. And so I'll pass the mic to Carolyn and to Mo.
Thanks, Casey. And for Agua Fund, I think what's really exciting about the Funders Advisory Council is that we don't know the specifics. Again, we're not the ones setting the agenda and giving ourselves deliverables. We're here to help. So it is really, again, about supporting the community-based organizations. Based on my personal background, I'm not going to be able to have that same connection to community that has been harmed as some of the partners, so want to make sure that we're a resource. So some of it could be helping with the application and advising on the review process, but again, we're never going to be the ones making that final decision, and I think that's really exciting.
And I don't have a lot to add to that, but I will say that we do run a couple of participatory grant-making programs at Prince Charitable Trust. And one of the things that we hear a lot from the people, the community advisory groups that come in and make the decisions on the grant-making, is they had no idea how hard it was to give away money well. And so I feel like one role that we can play is helping sort of advise on the evaluation side, on the setting up the process, like Mo was just saying, and just sort of using some of the experience that we have in doing it well.
And that's something that we're really excited about, is to leverage the networks and the expertise of funders, but only in support of the decision making of the partners, which is, yeah.
Another key component to the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Fund are having the community hubs that are on the ground that are not only informing the funding decisions, but are providing outreach and technical assistance for prospective applicants. And so, Jerome, my question is for you. I was interested if you could share more about how Overbrook will be conducting community outreach for this funding opportunity in Pennsylvania, and what recommendations do you have for how qualifying communities can get connected to their local hub?
Well, the beauty of our work is that we would probably do the work whether we were part of this consortium or not. I mean, because the thing is that, these are conditions that are stressing and burdening communities, and if you have the ability to get beyond your own self-interest, which is what I find is an attribute of many of our CBOs and community-based organizations, in every group dynamic, you have different types of individuals within that dynamic. Some who are just responding to issues and absorbing them in such a way where they feel hopeless about what solution looks like. And then you have groups who are actively engaged, and you have some who are actively disengaged. But the actively engaged constituents in those groups are the ones who try to get beyond their own self-interest to help the best interests of all of those who are in the group. And so the organization, the Overbrook Environmental Education Center, we've been very active in just trying to unburden the community around these environmental stressors. And the result for us is that we try to associate with a variety of resources. I like to say that as an analogy, we're like the ligament that holds the muscle to the bone. You never see somebody blow out their meniscus. They can be so strong, but just not having that strong ligament is a real problem for them. And so that connective relationship is important. But, just the whole nature that we're part of a Mid-Atlantic group enables us to develop best practices from our colleagues that normally, environmentalism is very local. And so you only are dealing with sometimes the solutions of the problems that you see right in your community. But imagine having the benefit of being able to talk to a colleague in West Virginia or a colleague in Maryland or a colleague in Delaware, and they say, hey, this is what we've been able to do, and this is how we've benefited from our work, and share those kinds of experiences so that we can all be more collectively enhanced by it. But in our area, we're actually planning a symposium in October, 17th, 18th, and 19th. Dr. Wilson will be there. He doesn't know it yet. But, but the result is to find creative ways to engage the community, to entice them, and to come together to realize that there are resources available, there's support. We talk about technical assistance. But what we do is we change the language to make it a bit more colloquial. Right? Because we have to understand that the communities that need resources the most may not be scientific people. They're people who are just responding to their life and the stresses that are impacting their life. So we do a lot of meaning making, a lot of interpreting of information, a lot of interpreting of the resources, and try to structure events and activities that will enable people to see a host of communicating around both the science, both the technology, and both the practices in the field. And last but not least, you know, everything that we do within our community work, we structure in a three-part component. The first part is to let people know what the issues are, or to talk about the issues. The second part is to ask, why should it matter to you? To keep it and identify why it's personal to you and why that should matter. And then we talk about what you can do about it. So the issue is for us is being able to identify the concerns, the environmental concerns, the environmental stressors, gain the resources through our philanthropic communities and through our governmental partners, and then realize that we're those champions that are cheerleading this fight around making certain that people know that there's solution and remedy for the problems that we've identified in the communities.
Casey, could you share more about the timeline for launching the Environmental Justice Fund and the next steps for those that are interested, and how much money are you anticipating will be available for projects?
Yes, so right now, we've raised almost 8 million in funding for the initiative. Yes, and we are we're going to kind of hit the ground running real fast here, y'all, at the end of September. My colleagues in the back are Samara and Jose can wave. They're the leads of the program. And if y'all want to talk to them later, please do. They're lovely people. And the partnership, that's for the administration, of course, the partnership decision-making groups. For folks that are leads for an environmental justice hub for the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Justice Fund, please raise your hands. I know I saw a few folks earlier. They may have walked out, but the partnership will begin meeting in earnest in October and November to develop the application package that will launch in December. It will open in December and the first deadline will close in March. The reason that we're trying to do this relatively quickly is that the initial major slug of funding that came through was from USDA Forest Service, and the work that funding available will support workforce development work on the ground. It can support capacity building for nonprofits to build their ability to do workforce development and work towards forestry implementation, and then obviously forestry implementation projects as well. And then the funding that we've raised from our partners to my right is more flexible. It can support things that the federal government is, less flexible in supporting. And so our hope is to find more unrestricted revenue, zip it together with the federal dollars, and be able to, on an annual basis, open the program in December with a deadline in March for 4 years. And if we're able to raise more money, to lengthen the process so that it'll stand past the initial 4-year term that's been invested in. With the funding we have, that means we'll have about 2.5 to 2.8 million a year available through the RFPs. I think folks may or may not know that forestry work, there's some science that tells us that it's most impactful to plant in fall as opposed to spring. Trees are just more successful when you do that. And again, this isn't just tree planting, but that is an end goal for USDA Forest Service. And so getting people funding and an acknowledgement that they're going to be receiving that funding by the beginning of April will allow them to prepare for fall planting seasons. So we're tied to our natural systems in some ways when we think about the timeline of this program. But that's I think I answered all the sub-questions there.
And a little bit of my next question that was for you and Dr. Wilson was just thinking about how are you thinking about the long-term sustainability of the fund, if it will be a time-bound effort or something that you will continue in perpetuity?
Yeah, I'll jump in and just go back to a previous comment and make a connection first. So many of the hub partners that are part of this fund are also hub partners that are part of the TIC-TAC. So I want to be clear about that. But also, they're hub partners on the Mid-Atlantic Climate Action Hub. So you got the Mid-Atlantic Climate Action Hub, which is funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Webley Street Foundation, which focuses on climate justice. So then you have the TIC-TAC, as you know, is providing technical assistance to communities who are experiencing environmental energy justice issues. So you have the South Baltimore Community Land Trust, you have the Overbrook Center, you have Session Shin, you also have Central Depot, you're familiar, you have Empower DC, and then on the, as part of the EJ Fund, we also have one HBCU partner, no, two HBCU partners, Morgan State and also Howard, and we're going to add another partner from Virginia, right, from Virginia. So there's a lot of synergy that's happening across Match, the TIC-TAC, and the EJ Fund. So part of the question about sustainability is not just a funding part, it's programmatic, it's that synergy, the durability, is because of the anchor institutions that I just outlined, who are doing the work in the geographic area coverage, but also, as Jerome said, that we're connected to each other. So those are ligaments within their own community, but also ligaments across the region. So that's going to help with sustainability and durability. On the funding side, we're going to be pushing to access more of the BIL and RA funds. We're going to be making sure we try to connect to the state dollars as well. Many of the states have their own funding mechanisms. And of course, we want to push the philanthropic family within the region. So the Funders Network, also networks like Health Environmental Funders Network, and also many of the national funders who've known to step into the space, like Kresge Foundation and others. I just named Kresge because I'm biased. I'm on the Equity Advisory Board just to be, to share that. But Kresge and others. So state level of sources, state regional foundations, and also national foundations.
Amazing. That was my last question since we abbreviated our panel, and we are 20 minutes ahead of schedule. So I think we can just open up for Q&A unless there's any, I know with modifying things, was there anything that folks didn't say that they had prepared to say originally that they wanted to make sure was covered?
The only thing I wanted to add, I suppose, is how excited I am about the fund and how honored I don't want to just speak for my colleagues, we are that we're able to support such an amazing partnership that already existed and that they're trusting us to help. Because I recognize that philanthropy's not always been the most trustworthy system, and so I just wanted to appreciate the trust that is being provided us, and we're going to do our very best to help establish a participatory fund with very restricted revenue and try to navigate a path forward that allows folks to feel that they owned the process despite the restrictions from the feds. So, yes.
And if I could just echo Casey's excitement, at AGWA we started talking about trying to support some sort of participatory grant making a couple years ago, and this partnership, like Casey said, it already existed. So it was really just about us opening our eyes and resourcing the great work that's already been done to hopefully take it to another level. So really excited for this to actually become a reality and to start supporting amazing groups on the ground.
And I'll add a quick comment. Going back to the question about sustainability and going back to Mustafa's point about power, I mean, I think it's really important that when we do this kind of work, it's grounded in community, right? Community knows best. There needs to be other community for the community and by the community. And so I think this fund is an opportunity to do that because we have frontline, fence line, authentic grassroots groups. Again, I'm going to go back to the presentation yesterday. Y'all saw the criteria. All the groups who are community groups that are part of this, they y'all are primary groups, okay? Now I got to give y'all the scoring methodology. We're still working on that part, but the brief will be out soon. But the groups that are primary need to be leading this work. That's the point. And so if you have any federal dollars that are under Justice 40, if you're talking about environmental justice, you got to live it out. You have to actualize it. And we're trying to actualize it with this fund. Not just, one of the little quips like to say, there's a lot of folks in this EJ space now. Just because you know your alphabet and you know the letters E and J don't mean you're doing EJ. You may be playing EJ. We're doing EJ. This is serious work. So this fund's about serious work to help our communities that have been impacted and been poisoned. And I'll pass the mic back.
Why do I have to follow this guy? No, I think just to leverage what Dr. Wilson is saying is that, for us, we know that this is a social architecture that sustains and keep resilient communities. And these collaborations has to become a new normal. And I think oftentimes you don't see yourself as being part of a historical construct when you're in it, but I think we need to be aware of that. That it's okay for us to establish a new normal where we have federal agencies and state agencies and community organizations and philanthropic organizations, universities, working collectively together to do what? Help those who need our services the most. And I think that in order for that to work, the level of leveling of equitable contribution and informed consent has to be a baseline for everything that we do. And oftentimes when I started this work 20 plus years ago, organizations would try to tell you what they needed from you as opposed to asking what you needed to be supported with. So we go back to the fundamentals of being able to seek more to understand than to seek to be understood. And if we work with communities with that perspective, I think we're going to really, really start to draw out the true need. Because if you don't have good relationships, you're not going to get the truth. And if you don't get the truth, we're not doing the good work. So let's get to the point where we can do authentic work by allowing communities to feel comfortable being in the space of being able to speak with people who have resources and power and influence and be able to speak truthfully, not angrily, not in a frustrated manner, but in a collaborative, collegial manner where they know they're being heard even if the way they express themselves is different. Does that make sense? Even when you find people who are just frustrated and they come to you and they tell you what their frustration, what their issues are, don't take that as a means of that person not being sophisticated about understanding their problem. They just have a different form of communication, more excitement about what it is that's stressing them. But I think we're creating a foundation. We're making room for the opportunity for people who speak different, who have different, we're different places on the trajectory. If you're more closely related to the burden and problem, you're going to feel different than someone who's removed from it. So I think we're creating that social architecture. We're creating that basis for which we're going to engage ourselves, and it's foundationally healthy enough to sustain us over the course of time. And I think that's one of the key elements to what we're building, and we should see ourselves building something historical and respected accordingly.
Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, I have one online question from Julie. They asked, how many other EJ participatory funds have been formed in other areas/regions? And they also say, would love to see this replicated in more areas and communities.
Thank you.
Would you like for me to repeat the question part?
I think we're just trying to figure out who's going to answer the question.
Okay.
And the answer.
become part of the Mid-Atlantic region and you have the answer solved.
I would say, you know, when you look at, so from the EPA side, you do have the grant makers program. So you can say that program, depending upon how they're structured, and I'm not sure how each grant makers is structured in each region, but that's potential for those to be participatory because they have to have engaged, you know, communities as well. So you can say that there's participatory nature to that to that pot of funding. Now I know there's other entities out there doing like EJ accelerators that may have a participatory nature to them as well. I'm going to give a shout out to the HOB Fund and some of the work that the HOB Fund is doing. I think you also have Mosaic, which is not necessarily, maybe not a fully participatory model, but as it relates to how they engage folks to get funding. So I think there are a number of entities that are bringing in these elements of being more inclusive when it comes to community voices, being more inclusive when it comes to grassroots voices, being more inclusive when it comes to authentic EJ voices in their processes. So those are three examples that I can provide, but there may be a few others that fellow panelists may know about.
We're having a little chat. There are other participatory funds, but not necessarily devoted to environmental justice, which was what we were whispering about. Which we'd be happy to share about those, but ultimately they're not devoted to environmental justice, so it doesn't really answer the question.
I definitely agree that it is something that we hope gets replicated elsewhere because it's super important. Any questions in the room? And I should have also said that I hope you have questions. And when you ask your question, if you could just introduce yourself, your name and organization for the panelists, that would be great.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for serving and providing great content. I'm Larry Davis with Ridge to Reefs and Green Mechanics. We're working on an environmental justice grant for the town of Eagle Harbor. It's the last predominant African-American town at a waterfront. And there's a long historicity with the town and also this long history of a coal power plant that was installed adjacent to the town several decades back. We're taking efforts to do some baseline monitoring for the soils, water, biologics, for looking at the potential impacts that the power plant may have had on the town. One of the many challenges that we're seeing is that not just with the town of Eagle Harbor, but the other surrounding areas, communities are inquiring about whether what their impacts have been or how they've been affected by the power plant. And right now we're trying to figure out other resources or funds to help assist other communities, but right now we're tied to Eagle Harbor. And so wanted to just put that out there and see if there's any content or direction that you might recommend for this particular scenario. So.
Yeah, so going back to the grant makers program, so Green Health Homes Initiative, they have a table here. I think they should have a table, their exhibitor, so you can learn more, but that would be probably the most appropriate opportunity for folks in this region when you want to, looking at some of those other issues that outline. As we said, the USDA funding for this is more around forestry, but that gives probably a little bit more flexibility to look at those issues. Now, on the scientific technical assistance side, there is we do have the Charm Center that's at Hopkins. So for more scientific support, that would be an entity that can be engaged by those other communities. And so we do have Maddie Orberg and I believe Laura and also Dr. Haney, who are here from the Charm Center that you can talk to. But I would say funding-wise within the region, I think the primary source of funding for some things you outlined would probably be grant makers. So Green Health and Homes Initiative, they're the lead for the grant makers program in our region. How many more minutes do we have?
10:51, so we have 10 minutes.
We take 2 more questions.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions is what I am.
Testing.
Yeah, can you pass that mic, please? And say your name and organization. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kimberly Armstrong from Baltimore Green Justice Workers Cooperative, and I also have a comment and a question. So I want to thank Casey, who also gave us some funding when we first got started. We're a very new nonprofit working around a lot of green, around the green economy. I also want to thank Dr. Sokobi because we also got funding from him as well. So thank you for that. So I guess my question is that when you have been doing the work and finally get to a space where you get your 501c3 and you go after funding, I heard the young man up there talking about the stresses. And a lot of the stresses not just come from doing the work, but a lot of the stresses also comes from trying to get the money and then I guess you could say getting the money, and then the little bit of money that you get, you got to keep doing it. So you also got to do the work. You're trying to build a capacity. You're trying to do all these things. So I guess my question is, how is it that we can not just help one another, but also make it so it's not so complicated and so, stressful for not just us in the community, but also us who are doing the work and trying to get it done, but also trying to feed ourselves as well. Because this work, not only is it hard work, but we also want to be to a place where as though we're not being spoon-fed a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, and also try to help us help ourselves. I guess that's my question.
You make an excellent point, and we've been talking probably over the last couple of years about it's the most fundamental part of self-care, because you mentioned something. There is a psycho-emotional impact because you are essentially a caretaker. You're a caretaker in the environmental space, but you're caretaking over the earth. You're caretaking over people. You're caretaking over the environment, and that's a very stressful work. And so there is a great deal of consideration now for creating associations, affinity associations, where CBOs and nonprofits get together. In most cases, what we do at the Overbrook Center, we create what we call community advisory boards. And those community advisory boards not only help us to inform what priorities we need to take on, but we work together as a sort of a support group. We support each other. And so if there's a community group where they have very few resources and very few staff members to help them deal with their issues, we come together and give them emotional and psychological and physical support around their ability just to endure throughout that process. So you're right on target. First thing I think is always important is to know you're not alone in that. You're not just going through that alone. It's something that we all go through when we're developing. You say you're a new organization as part of our growing pains, but I will encourage you, and I could talk to you offline, some of the real strategies that we put in place to help deal with that issue of just not allowing yourself to feel overwhelmed in the work. But hang in there. You're not alone, and do engage in self-care, and don't allow yourself to get too overwhelmed, because we need you tomorrow. Thank you.
Last question to the left. Yes. It's on. It was on.
Howard, D.C. and Washington, D.C. I appreciate everything everyone is talking about. When we're looking at advisory boards, or we're a part of advisory boards, a lot of times everyone is sizing up each other's qualifications or resumes. And I understand we're talking about the mental health, not only of the community that's been traumatized, but the folks that's in the community that's doing the work. We're working in fence line, frontline communities that's dealing with power plants and poisonous toxins in the air and pollution and like Ivy City, urban heat island effect, lack of tree space, holding agencies accountable. How do we get through that without being frustrated or without talking with aggression like I do all the time? Or when we're in these advisory boards meetings and we have a lot of, like you said, academia, how do we get this in these places, these colleges, these universities, these classrooms? I think it should start in elementary school, to be honest. If you start in elementary school and get the mentorship, then by the time you get to college, you already understanding. Like, it's almost like we're teaching university students how to have empathy, or teaching scientists how to have empathy if they don't already have it. So, Dr. Sokobi, you was talking about that yesterday. How do we do this? How can we get this, weed out the people that's just here because of the money or because it's a thing? When it's not a thing, we're fighting for our lives. I've been saying that. I'm saying that every day. We're fighting for our lives. How do we get people into these rooms, into these communities, into academia to realize that? Because some of them are not. They just were taught. How do we spread this across the country to make sure that it's every day? It's like taking a bath.
You asked a lot of questions.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. And this is going to be I'll close it out because I know we got to get us back on track. I would say a couple things. So we try to start an organization called 17 for Peace and Justice. Y'all know what the 17 stands for, of course, right? 17 Principles of Environmental Justice. Okay, y'all. So that's one thing we can do is we have a chapter on University of Maryland campus. You know, we can spread 17 for Peace and Justice chapters, just like NAACP chapters. We actually be collaborative with NAACP. So have chapters in the community and have chapters on campuses. That's one thing to do. As pertains to academia, I say yesterday, academia is a broken system. It's a research industrial complex. You got healthcare that's about sick care. Academia is about it's the same thing. It's like a sick care process. You got to transform that culture. You have to have people on the inside who are pushing back. But someone's on the inside are getting worn out. But then somebody said, Reverend, did you say that too? Getting worn out, getting worn down, right? So you got to find the right institution. Some institutions, you got to have institutions that's for us, by us. That's why I mentioned the MSIs and HBCUs. Now, they have made some of their own challenges, right? But I would say that's a place to start instead of going to some of the big universities who have a system of, extraction from our communities. Go to some smaller ones. Shizuka raised a hand yesterday about the minor at Trinity. Trinity is a primary black institution now. Now go to Howard. You got a lot of HBCUs that are in this region. You got MSIs across the country. So let's prioritize those institutions. And when it comes to Justice 40, federal government, if you're listening, those should be the top of the heap when it comes to getting Justice 40 related funding. MSIs, not PWIs. I'm going to say it again. MSIs, not PWIs. Y'all say that in the audience. MSIs, not PWIs, okay? So that's part of the response too. In addition, when they're having courses, right, making sure that those courses are community driven. Dr. Wright talked about in her presentation on opening a keynote about the community university model, making sure that we implement the community university model at all institutions, right? And also these institutions, they need to be accredited. We should have an EJ accreditation programs. If you're not accredited, you shouldn't be doing this work. If you're not accredited in community engagement, community science, participatory science, participatory action, applied science, solution science, justice science, you shouldn't be doing this work. So don't come to my community if you ain't accredited. Don't come to my community if you ain't been co-signed by community. Don't come to my community if we're saying they're good people. Don't come to my community if you're not about real impact and real change. Don't come to me if you ain't for us, if you ain't by us. Okay? I'm a calm down. But you got to challenge these institutions. You got the knowledge. You got the power. They don't. You got the knowledge. You got the power. They don't. It's your money. Stop our money from going to institutions that don't serve us. Submit complaints to the federal government about extraction. Civil rights, I know the case. Use the Civil Rights Act. Use other acts that say universities, if you're not for us and by us, get out of our communities. If you're not doing something about change, get out of communities. If the people who are teaching my students don't look like us, get out of communities. Even if you're doing projects, they're real tangible outcomes, real solutions. Get out of our communities. And then remove your footprint. Take your brick and mortar somewhere else. Okay? I'm going to stop talking, y'all.
I thought I had to get the cape on James Brown. No, I think Dr. Wilson, you know, he's very passionate, very truthful about the work, but I want to go back to the questioner. You know, you really got to see the work as part of a systems work, as part of a process. If you think of it, if you start accumulating all of the work as if it's one big burden, it's going to be hard to get work done. So think of it as a systems process, break it down into manageable tasks, and make certain that you realize that some things you may not be able to get to. It may be for someone else to do, right? So find out what you're good at, find out your strategic advantage, and work on that. Because we need people good at this work too. If we're going to Dr. Wilson's point, if other people get out of the way, and now you got to take it on, you got to be good at taking it on. Got it? All right.
Well, thank you all. I know we are over time. We just appreciate your time and expertise, and we're so excited to see the fund launch this fall. So thank you all.
Thank you. So we got to catch up on time, family. Thank you for those who are watching us online. Let's transition to our concurrent sessions, and hopefully we can get started on the 10. Was it 11? What time is it right now? Okay, thank you. So let's get started on the 10, y'all. So let's get to our concurrent session and start at 11:10. Thank you.